What's happening? Welcome to the 67th episode of the Slapstream. And today I have a guest that it's not strictly a bass player, but he played bass, rockabilly, slap bass, like for more uh, original rockabilly artists that most of the bass players these days. So I think that he deserves a place in Slapsville, and that's the reason why I decided to feature him on the Slapstream. Before I introduce him, I would like to thank all of you for supporting the Slapstream, for buying these Art of Slap Bass t-shirts. Now I'm wearing the red one, although I think that the black one is still my favorite. And if you want to get one, just click on the link in the description of this video. And there's like plenty of cool slap bass designs. I plan on work on some more. If you have any ideas, send me an email at contact@artofslapbass.com. Thanks a lot for supporting me via Venmo and PayPal and Patreon. That's the most important one. If you haven't checked that one out, I offer lots of perks. I had some time to figure that out during the lockdown, during Corona, during the end of the world time, and it's going pretty well now. I still think I still have some ideas, but it's pretty much there. All right, without further ado, I would like to introduce my friend, an artist, a singer, a showman, a bass player. Here from, usually I used to introduce him from the entertainment capital of the world, Hollywood, but this time I'm going to say that he is from Slapsville. All right, DEKE Dickerson.
How's it going, Djordje?
Hi, it's going great. Welcome to Slapsville.
Well, thanks for having me on your show. Although, man, you must have run out of bass players if you're featuring me.
Oh, definitely not, but I figured out, that you played bass like for such a long time. You paid attention to the bass sound, to slap bass sound more in particular, and that like most of the people these days. So like, you deserve to be here. So I offer you the citizenship here in Slapsville.
Well, I appreciate that.
So how have you been doing during these crazy times?
Well, like everybody, just trying to navigate this crazy new world. The thing that I was doing during the last year and a half was kind of making these a cappella videos where I played all the different instruments. And at first they kind of started out simple, and then they got very elaborate, and I was doing lots of different kinds of music that I don't normally do. So that much was actually fun. And it was great to see how many of my fans and supporters actually kind of helped me out financially, because like a lot of us, without that online stream of revenue, I don't think I could have paid the bills after all the gigs and the festivals and everything went away.
It's so crazy. And whoever is interested, I love those videos, by the way. And whoever is interested to check them out, a link for those videos, quarantine DEKE Dickerson videos, it's also in the description of this video, as well like other DEKE Dickerson social media handles. All right, I would like to present you mostly as a bass player. I know that people are familiar in general, like with your overall career, but I would like to talk a little bit about that, about like how you started, how you got interested in music and rockabilly, slap bass in particular, and then let's take it from there. So how did you get started? How did you get interested in music and rockabilly and all of that stuff?
Well, I'll try to make my answers, somewhat succinct. I won't go on too much. But, I was one of these kids. I was very young in the 1980s. But, when the Stray Cats hit it big, and then there's all these other kind of bands like the Blasters and the Rock Cats and the Polecats and everything, they were actually on the charts, and I was a kid growing up in the middle of a farm in Columbia, Missouri. And so it was definitely the Stray Cats that sort of, got my attention with rockabilly. But then shortly after that, I discovered Gene Vincent and the Blue Caps and Eddie Cochran and, all of the great obscure artists that we love. So, like a lot of people who lived in the country, it was like, okay, well, we see these guys playing these giant fiddles and they appear to be slapping them, but it was like this complete mystery. how it was done. And my first couple of bands were rockabilly bands, but we had electric bass players because there were no upright bass players. And eventually we got an upright bass player who was, about 10 or 15 years older than me. And he was a great bass player, but he was a bluegrass bass player. So, he just played pizzicato. He didn't do any slapping. And so at that time, there were a lot of rockabilly bands like that, where you could tell there was one guy that was really into everything. And then there was another guy that was kind of on board. And then like a third or fourth member of the band that were, like didn't dress the part and didn't play the right kind of instruments. So there was a lot of bands like that back then. But like a lot of things, I sort of decided that I was going to solve this mystery in my head. And when I was about 15 years old, this is only maybe a year or two after I started playing guitar, I decided I was going to get an upright bass and I was going to learn how to play slap bass. And so there was a music store in the suburbs of St. Louis, and I know I've told you this story, and I love to tell it to all the bass players I know because it always makes them, their heads explode. But I kept hearing this rumor that there was this music store that had a basement full of upright basses, and they were $200 each. And so when I decided, yes, I'm going to buy a bass and learn how to play slap bass, I inquired, like, where is this place? And it was I can't even remember now. It was St. Anne Music, like kind of outskirts of St. Louis. And so my dad and I drove up there one Saturday, and the regular music store was completely uninteresting, but they did a lot of school band instruments. And I said, somebody told me that you guys have a basement full of upright basses. And this old guy just kind of looked up at me and he goes, $200, your choice. Just turn off the light when you come back up. And so I went to the door going down to the basement, turned on the light, and I couldn't believe what I saw, because probably, like for 50 feet in one direction and 30 feet in another direction, it was just full of upright basses. And, I guess that they were like the school band orchestra people in St. Louis, and somehow or another that wound up being like the upright bass graveyard. And I didn't know anything at the time, knowing what I know now, there were probably Epiphones and carved top basses and everything else like that down there. I literally didn't know anything at all, but they had a ton of Ks. So I kind of decided I was going to pick out a K, and I just kind of looked until I found the best looking one, because they were all beat up. So I found the one that was the least beat up, and I bought it for $200. And I took it home, and of course it had metal strings on it. So the first thing I did was try to figure out, how do you get gut strings? And nobody had gut strings at that time. You could not get them from where I was at. And so I just kind of taught myself how to slap using the steel strings. And, of course, being 15 years old, what's the first thing you do? You learn how to stand up on the bass, like, was it Rex from Bill Haley's Comets that used to stand up on the bass? And
Al Rex, yeah.
Al Rex, or Marshall Lytle. And so, before I even learned how to properly play bass, I was like, okay, I got to learn how to stand on the bass and, still be able to play it. But, eventually I sort of made friends with the bass, and I sort of figured out, like, okay, this is a whole different thing than the electric bass. And it's a whole different thing than the pizzicato, orchestra jazz kind of bass. It's just a completely its own animal. So, I did a lot of playing back then, and a lot of practicing. And then over the years, even though I've mostly been a guitar player and a band leader, there's just been a number of occasions where I have wound up playing bass, or, did a session thing on bass, or, like you mentioned at the beginning of the episode, played bass behind some of the legends from the 1950s, that kind of a thing. So all those hours that I spent when I was a teenager in my room in Missouri, just, tick, 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 they've kind of paid off, because I feel like I can actually play the bass. At least I always tell myself I can play the bass the way that I want a bass player to play the bass.
And you played it on some of your records, right?
I have, although if you pressed me for what songs and what albums, I couldn't tell you. But yes, I do remember playing it in the studio and that sort of thing.
So do you remember, how did you figure out how to do that slap? Did you have a chance like to see somebody like play live, or it was just like
No, you know,
TV or what?
the only thing back then that you could really see was the Stray Cats, you know, and Lee Rocker has that very primitive kind of slap, because I think he also used steel strings, and I remember, you know, you'd read like what was the kind of pickup he had? It was like a Helpin still, like you know, the company that made a piano pickups, they also made this electric acoustic bass pickup, and so you'd see that, and you could kind of tell like it wasn't, you know, this is not the same as Marshall Lytle or any of those kind of guys from the 50s. And then there was this terrible article that came out in Guitar Player magazine where they asked Paul Burleson how they got the slap sound in the Johnny Burnett and the Rock and Roll Trio. And I know you know what I'm talking about, where Paul Burleson says, oh yeah, he just detuned the low E string, and then he would just, you know, play the note, and then he would slap that floppy low E string to get the slap. And I remember doing that and working on it for an afternoon where I was like, this isn't it. This is terrible. This doesn't do anything. I have no idea what he's talking about. But you know, it probably wasn't until you know, I had a surf band called the Untamed Youth, and that was the first band that I ever toured around with. I was a teenager, and you know, we started touring to the East Coast and touring to the West Coast, and we did a show in Richmond, Virginia with High Noon. And I think this was probably 1989, something like that. I didn't move to California until 1991. So 1989, we crossed paths with High Noon, and I saw Kevin Smith playing, and I was like, holy cow, that guy's doing it. That's it right there. He figured it all out. And you know, once I moved to California, there were several players out there, Russell Scott and Lloyd Martin that played with Dave and Deke Combo, and a couple other players that I'm forgetting now. And of course, Fred Maddox was still around, you know, so I got to see Fred Maddox. And then High Noon toured out there, so I got to see Kevin Smith a bunch. So by the early 90s, when I was living in California, that's when it really started getting into my brain of how exactly the slap style should be played.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that you, from the very beginning, you wanted to achieve that gut sound on upright bass, but pretty much at that time nobody played guts, right? Even on the rockabilly scene, if I understand.
No,
correctly.
and no, because at that time you could not order gut strings. I mean, maybe if you lived in Germany, you know, where Getz is or wherever, but like if you went to the orchestra place and you said, I want to order gut strings, because I did this at one point, and they said, no, they don't make those anymore. All you can get is steel strings. I think the best you could get was like the steel wrapped nylon strings. That was about it. And I remember when I moved to California, Lloyd Martin, who was playing bass for the Dave and Deke Combo, and also Russell Scott, who I mentioned earlier, both of those guys had all gut strings, including a gut E, and I had never seen that before. And I'm like, wow, I didn't even know that existed. And they said, oh yeah, we get them from this company called Getz or whatever they are. And that was really the first time I had ever even seen gut strings.
Huh, that's interesting. I didn't know that it was so hard to get them. I just thought it was kind of the fashion in the 80s that, you know, everybody kind of started on steel strings because they were like all widely available, and most of the people started because of the Stray Cats. And you know, Lee Rocker at that time, he was playing steel strings, although he plays mostly guts now.
Right. Well, the funny thing is, you know, and I'm not that old, even though this sounds like a million years ago, but before the internet, man, it was like you were in the wilderness. You know, you'd see a picture of a guy playing an upright bass, and you'd hear a record of a guy playing an upright bass, and then you just kind of tried to figure it out in your brain, like, how are they getting that sound? Blah, blah, blah. And the problem is like I said, the only bass players that existed then were orchestra players, jazz players, and maybe a country player who, you know, played upright bass at one time, but none of those guys were slappers. So it was literally like, if you knew 100 bass players, none of them used gut strings and none of them slapped. So you were trying to figure out something that had literally died and nobody was doing it anymore. And it, you know, if it weren't for guys like Kevin Smith and people like that, I think it totally would have died, and you know, it would have gone the way of the dodo bird or something.
Yeah, who knows what would happen. So thanks, Kevin. Yeah, Kevin is like so influential to lots of folks, and great guy and great slapper. And he was the star of the first Slapstream as well.
There you go.
Yes, and now it's like a 67 episode of the Slap Bass Talk. Can you imagine?
And here you are interviewing guitar players about playing bass.
Well, you just told me you were a bass player. You started playing bass when you were a kid. So doesn't that make you a bass player?
Well, do you know Billy Horton?
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah, you know, Billy Horton, he really doesn't give compliments ever. And I remember once he saw me play bass, a gig in San Diego or something, and this is such a Billy Horton thing to say. He said, you know, I saw you pick up that bass, and I thought it was gonna really suck, and yeah, it didn't suck that much. I was like, okay, well, it's about as good as you can get from him, so I'll take it.
That's awesome. Well, I played steel strings with you.
I know.
Yeah.
And I'd see you going crazy slapping with those steel strings, and I'm just thinking, his poor hands, when he's 65 years old, he won't even be able to make a fist.
I'm just gonna make the steel strings thicker when I'm 65.
Okay. Or maybe by that time they'll have some robot hand, so you know you can just cut off your regular hand and put on this awesome robot hand where you can go something
super
like that.
psycho.
Yeah.
So when you said like in the 80s, I would like to talk a little bit about a rockabilly scene back then. It was mostly like neo rockabilly, right? Even in the States, there was no like Teddy Boy thing like in Europe, and like not much psychobilly, if I understand as well. And then you guys, like, I mean, you and Robert, Big Sandy, kind of like, and I guess High Noon as well, like wanted to make it more traditional. That was kind of the idea, like towards the end of the 80s, early 90s or something.
Yeah, well, you have to understand in the States that having the Stray Cats on the charts with hit records, that was like a huge thing, because you know, all of a sudden you could actually get gigs playing rockabilly music. And so my very first band, which was, you know, I was 14 or maybe 15 years old, you know, we're talking about 1984, something like that. Man, if you went around to some place like a pizza place or a bar or a restaurant, you said, yeah, we have a rockabilly band like the Stray Cats. Like, oh, yes, we want to hire you. And you know, it's crazy. Like, I was making tons of money back then because that was popular and that was on the charts. And a lot of people don't really, you know, this many years later, they don't understand what that meant across the United States, because you've always got cultural stuff happening in Los Angeles and New York and Chicago that you don't have in other places. But, you know, to be able to get rockabilly gigs in a place like Columbia, Missouri, that was huge. So all of a sudden there was a demand, and then if you've got a demand, you're going to have bands that are created. So kind of all over the country, there were these bands that were, you know, instantly created to cash in on the Stray Cats thing. And some of them were very good and some of them were just horrible. And, you know, over the years, like, you know, I know we've seen all kind of stripes, but like I said, it really was like being in the wilderness, and, you know, just you'd see a few pictures, you know, maybe like a picture of the Stray Cats, and then you'd go see a picture of Gene Vincent and the Blue Caps, and then it's like, okay, well, we're going to form a band based on these 2 pictures, you know, and that was it, man. You didn't have like YouTube or any of these other things where you can just kind of endlessly, you know, figure out things. I mean, back then it was literally like you were in the wilderness by yourself.
And now the kids, if they want to find out anything about slap bass, should just watch, you know, 67 episodes of the Slapstream.
That's right. That's right. What a
Just,
service you are providing.
yeah, you see.
And
well,
you know,
really...
I have to say, like, you know, I wish we had that stuff back then, because really all it did was waste time, you know, because if you're trying to become a better guitar player, or you're trying to form a band, or you're trying to learn how to do recording and stuff like that, you know, man, some of that stuff would take years of just getting a tiny little nugget of information here, and then a tiny little nugget of information there. And then, you know, like nowadays you can just kind of go down the rabbit hole on YouTube or on the internet and find the answers to all your questions in one day. So I wish we had that back then. I don't make any claims like, oh, we were so valiant, you know, doing it all on our own back then. I'm like, no, man, I wish we had those tools back then.
But it also kind of took away some charm. I mean, just like streaming songs on Spotify is not as cool as, and not definitely not as exciting like buying a vinyl, or like looking at the cover and figuring out like, you know, what type of shoes, what kind of, you know, like bowling shirts or this, like these guys had. It took away lots of charm, I would say. But, you know, what do you think about equality? Do you think that things were kind of like a better back then? We're not talking about 40s and 50s, but like in the 80s, like pre-internet, and now when all the information is available, do you think the musicians are better, bands are better or worse? Or...
Well, I was just going to make a point that, you know, the only thing that really is advantageous to the old system is if you got a record. And when you mentioned, you know, the thing about finding vinyl records, in my hometown, we had one cool record store, and you would go down there and they had a little tiny rockabilly section. And I would go there once or twice a week. And if you were lucky, one new record would come in every couple of weeks. And of course you'd buy it because that's all there was to buy, you know. It's not like there was this huge choice of things to buy. And so, oh, Johnny Burnett and the Rock and Roll Trio, I've never heard of them, but this picture looks cool, so let's buy that. You know, the next couple of weeks, like, oh, here's Levi and the Rockcats. Well, okay, let's buy that. And so that was really sort of what dictated what I learned and what I got into, was what showed up at the record store. And the advantage to that is you'd play that record a million times. You know, you'd go home with your Johnny Burnett record and you'd play it and you're like, oh, that's great. Let's play it another 20 times today, and let's play it another 20 times tomorrow. So at the end of the day, you're kind of more well-versed in that stuff than nowadays. It's such sensory overload, man. You go to YouTube and it's like, okay, well, there's literally like 10 million rockabilly songs. And how do you even start? And maybe once you do start, how do you even have the time to appreciate that? So the one thing I will say is, back in those old days, you'd have a few records and you really appreciated them because you're just playing them over and over again.
Are those still your favorite records? Those few that you had back in the day?
Most of them, you know, like, I mean, I have to say that pretty much all of the 50s ones that I bought are still my favorites. A lot of those 80s records, it's like I was saying, you know, some of them were pretty good, and some of them were terrible. You know, like, I don't really have to name names, but like a case in point is Levi Dexter had this one record that showed up called The Fun Sessions, and it had this song called The Other Side of Midnight and a bunch of stuff, and it was like real early Danny B. Harvey playing guitar on it. That record's excellent. I mean, when I listened to that record a few months ago, I'm like, man, this record holds up. The songs are good, the recording is good, the guitar playing is great. But then the other record that you would find all day long, every day, was Levi and the Rockcats recorded at the Louisiana Hayride, right? And so you're thinking, oh, this has to be like the greatest record ever. And it's recorded really bad. The band isn't playing very well. Like, the audience doesn't really, like, you know, it's like English guys playing at the Louisiana Hayride. Like, people don't really understand what's going on. So there's not much audience reaction. It's just a weird record all around. So, you know, you'd have to buy both to see which one you liked. But I was actually kind of surprised when I played it recently how well that Fun Sessions album holds up.
And do you think that the musicianship, like, is in rockabilly is better now or than back then, or kind of the same, or?
You know, it's sort of the same in that there's always really excellent musicians and then there's always really bad musicians. There's something about rockabilly music, and I think it's like garage band music or any of those type of genres where people listen to it and the thing that appeals to them is they think like, I can do that. And so, you know, you get a lot of bands forming that are just guys in their neighborhood or buddies from work or whatever, and that's fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. I sort of love that on a grassroots level. But if you're talking about, do I really want to play that record again? Like, no, that record's terrible, you know? So that existed back then and it also exists now. I mean, there's definite like musicians in the scene that are incredible. And then there's other musicians that, you know, play all the time that just aren't very good, right?
I agree with you. That's kind of like, I think that rockabilly and punk are kind of the same in that way. You
Yeah.
have, you know, it's more important that, you know, you have like some buddies in a band and you guys sound like you work on the arrangements and you sound together. It's more important than individually you are amazing musician.
Well, and you know, you and I are definitely outliers because I think you and I both said to ourselves, I'm going to do this for a living. I'm going to do this and not have a day job. I'm going to play this kind of music and that's all I'm going to do. And you know, most people, it's just a little hobby, something they do on the side, and that's fine. You know, there's nothing wrong with that. But there's just a very small percentage of the scene then and now that say to themselves like, "Oh no, I'm going to make records. I'm going to tour, and this is going to be my career."
You know, I moved to the opposite side of the planet because of this music. So there you
Oh,
go.
I remember.
Do you have like any formal education?
Well, you mean music education?
Yes.
So, yes and no. I played saxophone in the school band and I learned how to read music. And, you know, of course, I joined the school band because I wanted to play saxophone like Bill Haley and the Comets or Boots Randolph. And I made the mistake of telling my band teacher that. And he just mocked me endlessly about that. Like, those people don't play the saxophone correctly. Why would you want to do that? And this band teacher also, he would actually say to the class, the two worst people in human history were both named Adolf Hitler and Adolf Sax, the man who invented the saxophone. Like, that was our teacher. So he hated the saxophone, and all I wanted to do was bum, 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 bum. And you know, now all these years later, I still love Bill Haley. I still love Boots Randolph. Like, I love the way those guys play, and I don't care. So my experience in the band was not very good, and then I had a really similar kind of experience when I tried taking guitar lessons. I was 13 or 14, and I was taking guitar lessons, and the guy was a hippie guy from my hometown, and he told my dad, he said, he's not going to get any better unless he quits listening to Buddy Holly. And so, you know, I was like, well, I like Buddy Holly, so no more guitar lessons, you know. And I really regret that, you know, I got so turned off by formal education because I wish that I would have had that opportunity to have done more with, you know, learning jazz and learning jazz chords and a lot of stuff that I sort of kind of figured out a little bit in my brain, but you know, I don't really know how to do it. It's just kind of doing it by ear.
And that's the interesting thing about formal education. It's really different for each person. For me personally, it was really important and it helped me out. And I decided to do, formal music school, jazz and classical, basically just to be originally just to be a better rockabilly bass player, and then
Right.
better bass player. And I think it helped me out, like understand music. But I can definitely see what you're talking about, with musicians that are strictly into jazz or like more complex music styles. I wouldn't say better by any means, because I don't believe in that. But I would be curious to hear from your perspective, what do you think? Why, like, all these guys, like, I mean, especially fusion guys, like if you ask them to play, I don't know, like regular rock and roll piano, or like if you ask like jazz guys to play regular like a blues or something, it's never right. It's like really simple music, what you just sang, like which Boots Randolph and all those guys like back in the day play it. It's simple, but if you ask like a jazz saxophone player, he does not know how to do it. He knows how to play, Charlie Parker solos left and right,
Yeah.
but it's pointless. It's just like in this music, it's just wrong, and it's really hard. It's almost harder like to make like an extremely good musician, but not extremely good musicians can do anything, but like really good musician to teach him how to play this music right. It's almost harder to do that than there's somebody who's kind of okay musician, and then just guide him into that direction, and feed
Yeah.
him with these sounds. What do you think? What is the reason for that?
Well, I grew up around all these guys, and the idea was the more notes you can play, the better musician you are. And so, the only guitar players I knew in my hometown were heavy metal guitar players. And, they just thought that rockabilly was the corniest thing in the whole world, and then, yeah, then I befriended some jazz guys and some bluegrass guys, and it's the same sort of thing. It was kind of like, they always approached it as, oh, that guy's really good. He can play like, and it was never really about the feeling or the soul or the touch. And what I really thought to myself as I got into different music more is, yeah, if I'm listening to bluegrass, I would much rather listen to Jimmy Martin, because I get so much more soul and feeling out of that music than I do listening to like one of these new bluegrass groups like, Hot Rise or Newgrass or whatever it is they call it. Like, yeah, those guys are real good and they play a million notes a minute, but there's just no, like, I don't feel that same soul to it. And that feeling goes across the board. And it's kind of why I gravitated towards older music in the first place, is that to me, I just always got more soul and more feeling out of older music than I did out of newer music. So getting back to what you're talking about certain musicians, what I've found is that the really awesome top of the heap musicians, if you throw stuff at them like, hey, let's do, a rockabilly song, they don't mock rockabilly. They don't think it's bad. Like, okay, we're going to approach this stylistically. It needs to be simple, but it needs to have, soulful phrasing, and it needs to have these kind of accents. They approach it from a professional attitude. And if you say, oh, we're going to do Western swing, or we're going to do like a 60s surf song, or we're going to do some blues, or we're going to do doo-wop, they approach it with respect, and they don't feel the need to play a million notes a minute because they think it's like heavy metal, or they think it's like jazz fusion. They understand that each of these different types of music genres needs an approach and sort of a style and a taste to make it work. And so the thing that you were talking about, how a lot of bass players can't do a simple blues or something like that, I literally think it's just because they're not as good as they think they are. If they were really top of the heap musicians, then their ears and their mind would be able to appreciate other types of music. So that's just my feeling on it.
I agree with you for sure. It's interesting, and that definitely applies, but my opinion applies like to slap. And if you talk to jazz musicians or I mean even bluegrass musicians, but or classical guys, they usually hate slap.
Yeah.
Not just like now I'm dead at that point. I mean, for a while now, because I had that jazz and classical education, and I can play fusion stuff, and I jammed with those guys. And then if I do something, they would respect it. But I remember when I was a kid and I played slap, it was just, oh, you just don't do that. It was just like, oh, yeah, it's not, you're ruining the fingerboard or something stupid.
Right.
It's a funny thing. Do you have your bass with you?
I do. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you mind playing something?
I don't. And this is actually the same bass. This is the K bass that I got out of the basement in St. Anne Music in the 1980s.
Huh? $200
Yeah,
bass.
$200. I've spent more on strings and bridges and other things like that over the years than I did for the bass itself. Hold on, I'm going to see if I can make this work. Wait, no, I can't seem to get the whole. I'm going to move it back a little bit. How's that?
That's pretty good. Pretty good.
That's probably about as good as I can get it with the horizontal frame. Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. For whatever reason, now you're like way quieter. Maybe I think I turned down the volume when I was moving the phone. Okay,
all
right.
right.
You're back.
Okay, so I want to hear DEKE Dickerson play slap bass.
What? Just some
whatever you
noodling around.
Whatever you feel like it, like I want to hear your approach. Billy Horton said that you don't suck much. So, and I always loved actually the way you play. You always kind of had, that like, Bob Moore, Dorsey Burnett kind of like a vibe. And I think that even on the songs that you recorded, that you played for me sometime, it was you had that approach, and that approach, I like that approach. So I want you to play. So you can also sing something if you want, like with the bass, whatever you feel like it.
Well, I'll just do a little, try to put this together in my head. You've got your Marshall Lytle kind of style that I love to do.
Awesome.
I love the drive of that. Then you got your Bob Moore thing. And then, I actually really love the Fred Maddox approach, where it's just because it's so insane. Yeah, you can tell I didn't practice for this at all.
Fred Maddox approach is a psychobilly approach, huh?
And I don't do a whole lot of that kind of triple slapping stuff because I never learned how to do it. I figured you guys have got that covered.
And you play with two fingers. You play with the middle finger and the point finger, or which one?
On the right hand, you mean?
Yes.
It's mostly the middle finger, and just kind of helped out a little bit by the first finger.
Oh, okay. And with your left hand, are you using I was not able to see it, but are you using the third finger as well, like the ring finger on the left hand, or not? You do.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll use the pinky as well, like when you go up and do something like this. That's all pinky.
All right.
Yeah, the action's pretty high on this, so like if you're going up this far, you kind of need to have like all of your fingers to just be able to press the string down.
I remember that bass. I played that bass on every tour I did with you, I think.
I think so, yeah.
I like that bass.
Well, unfortunately, I can't even remember who the last guy was that toured with my bass, but he put this different bridge on it, and he made a big thing of, I'm giving you this bridge, you can have this bridge, but like the lowest setting is way too high. Like I want to shave like about a 1/4 inch off the bottom of this bridge because it's way too freaking high for me. But you know, I get this thing out a few times a year, do a bass part on a record. I'm just kind of too lazy to change it.
Well, it wasn't me. It was a while ago, like since the last time I played that bass.
It's been a while since we toured together.
Oh yeah, it's been a long time. Like, I mean, proper tour, like really a long time. But you know, local gigs in there.
Was the last gig that you played with me that when Nick 13 came out and saw you at that Western Poetry Festival and then wound up hiring you for Tiger Army?
I mean, definitely one of the last ones, but I'm pretty sure we played Fullerton a couple times after that.
That could be.
Yeah, the one with that Big Sandy shows up.
Me, you, and Sugar Balls, I think it was.
It was Sugar Balls, yes.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah,
cool.
And yeah. I don't remember exactly, like, but yeah, what was the last gig, but. Yeah, you were pretty important to me. Like, you know, like when I played with you in Hollywood and with you and Joe Clay and Gene Summers when Danny Harvey asked me to join him and Lemmy and Slim Jim.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. And then didn't Drake's guitar player also ask you like for
your contact, yeah.
Yeah, something like that, right? So like some important gigs came from
and you know you. Brian Setzer texted me and said, can I get Djordje's number because I really want him to play with me? And I said, no, he died.
Yeah, I know.
No, just kidding. Brian Setzer does not text me.
Yeah. I thought, but you played with him, right?
Yeah, we got to jam together on a Outlaw, or excuse me, the Sirius XM thing. We did a live concert and he was in the studio next door. And the next thing you know, he's over there and he's playing with us and it was cool.
Yeah, how was that? What did you play?
We played The Race Is On and Mystery Train.
Did you enjoy it? I mean, he's like he was one of your heroes back in the day, right?
Well, and I kept telling him, and I couldn't tell if he thought it was a compliment or not, but I meant it as a compliment. I said, 15-year-old me is freaking out, man.
Well, I'm sure it was a compliment. And okay, so while you still have your bass with you, I would like to ask you about your bass setup. So if you don't mind, like telling me, you already said that that's a K bass. Do you know what kind of K bass that is?
I believe it's an M1.
Okay.
And I looked up the serial number one time, and it's a 1939. Oh. And you know, it's had a bunch of bad and good work done to it over the years, but it does still have the original tailpiece. The bridge has been changed out a bunch of times. I've had to reset the sound post about 1,000 times, you know. And these strings that are on it, I've got 2 gut and 2 steel wrapped gut, and boy, they're starting to get like all frayed and everything. I really need to get a new set, but like I said, it doesn't get used that much anymore.
It might be time for the steel strings then, huh?
No, I think I'm going with weed whackers.
Oh, you're really all going. Not even old school. Did anyone play the weed whackers back in the day?
The first time I remember seeing weed whackers was, you know, like when we went to Texas for the first time and we were staying with the High Noon guys. And of course, you know, Kevin Smith was using gut. But there was a bunch of upright bass players in Austin. It was like, wow, this is like a happening thing here, you know. And 2 or 3 of them were using weed whackers, but they were literally using weed whacker things. They weren't using the strings packaged as weed whacker strings. They were just using like, you know, plastic weed whacker line they would go buy at the hardware store because they could get a whole set for $5 or something.
Yeah. That was a weird fashion. Did you like? I mean, trend. Did you like that sound at all?
No, it was always too much like a rubber band. There wasn't enough fundamental. I mean, there was a ton of slap, but there just wasn't enough note.
What about your preference for bass pickups, bass amps, and anything else as far as gear goes on the bass?
Well, a lot of people have all the bass players I know have really chased their tail on the pickup things, and I'm really happy with the Underwood thing with just one of the two sides being stuck in the bridge. I've got it on the bass side, and I've had two Underwood pickups in the last 20 years. One of them went bad on me and I bought another one, but it's like, man, they're reliable. They just kind of give me that fundamental that I'm looking for. And I was never too concerned about getting a whole bunch of slap. I know Jimmy Sutton and I think you and a bunch of other bass players I've played with have a second pickup. But for me, the Underwood has been great. And, quite honestly, the last 10 years or so, I haven't even plugged it into an amp. I just, I think I've done 2 or 3 gigs playing bass for Carl Sonny Leyland. But beyond that, I just use it acoustically to record with.
Huh, interesting. And what is the reason that you personally decided to use just one piece of the Underwood?
Well, I used both of them for a long time when I first bought the pickup. And actually, I should go back and say, in those real early days where you were trying to figure out how this all worked, I met Ray Campy when my parents came out to California to go to Disneyland. I begged them to take me to meet Ronnie Weiser and Ray Campy. And when I met Ray Campy, I had just found this bass, and I was like, "What kind of pickup do you use?" And he says, "Oh, you got to get a polytone." And so I remember, man, the polytone pickup was expensive back then. It was like $125 or something. So, I saved up money and got a polytone bass pickup, and it was terrible. It was like the worst thing ever. I still don't quite understand how anybody used a polytone bass pickup. They're just awful. And so then when I moved to California, that was when I started seeing guys use Underwood pickups, and so that's when I bought my first one, and the instructions say, put them both in here. And then I seem to remember you are a big fan of using both of them installed when you play, right?
Yes, back then I did that, because one of the reasons why I did that is because I noticed that I do not have the same volume response like when I go higher on the G string. If I just use one piece of the Underwood, I know that is the thing that lots of people say that because of they go. I was trying you to say this, but it's out of the phase, and because of that, it's the better sound. But I used both, and mostly the reason for that is because when I was going on the G string, the volume would not be as leveled and as high as the E string. So then it was like pointless for me. I would be strong on E string and then I'll go play something in a thumb position or just something a little bit higher on the G string, and volume would drop. I was like, ugh, doesn't work for me.
Well, and the funny thing is that once I saw guys starting to take one of the sides out, there were guys that were treble side guys, and there were guys that were bass side guys, and I eventually kind of settled on the bass side, and it's been fine for me. That's how I like it. I like the sound of that better. But then, was it Kevin Smith that used to use the treble side of the Underwood? I mean, he always sounded great. So I think it's really just kind of how you play and how you do your EQ on your amp and all that kind of stuff.
I couldn't agree more. The sound is in the fingers. What about amps?
Well, for the longest time, just because of the guys that I saw playing out here, they were all using 115 cabinets, like old Fender Showman amps or Bassman 135 heads with a Showman cabinet. And that was kind of what everybody was using out here for the longest time. And it wasn't until I toured with Jimmy Sutton that he insisted on having a 410 cabinet. And so I went out and I found a 410 GK cabinet on Craigslist for $200 or something like that. And it's like, yeah, there is something to that. I've come to really love the 410 thing. And then when the GK crapped out, I found a used Eden 410 cabinet on Craigslist. And that's just all I've used ever since if I need an amp.
It's interesting that you mentioned that. I did not have a clue that it was popular to have a 115. And I'm a fan of tens. Right now I use like 8 tens, but 410 is great as well.
Yeah,
And I didn't know that Jimmy was the reason that you switched to that. There's
yeah.
something about tens that they respond better for slap, as far as my opinion, than 15s. I couldn't when Orange sent me the amps. They sent me 115 and 4 10s, and I just couldn't make it work that well. And then they sent me another 4 10s, and it's like, and that's what I've been using ever since.
Yeah, and the 410 works really well for electric bass too. It's just there's something about it.
Definitely. So now, since you're expert in like all the old stuff, how did slap bass players, like, what did they do back in the day, back in the 50s? I mean, back in 40s, back
Well,
40s, 50s.
that's such a funny thing because I think if they were in any kind of a noisy environment, just nobody ever heard the bass. And then when Elvis came around and started playing in front of 10,000 people, I asked Scotty Moore, like, well, what did you guys do? He said, well, most of these places we'd go in and we'd be playing to 10,000 people full of screaming girls, and they would just give us like one microphone that was the same microphone they used for, a boxing match or a cattle auction or whatever else they were doing there that week. That was it. There was nothing else. So you'd have drums, no microphones on them, bass, no microphone on it, guitar amp, no microphone on it, and then just Elvis singing with the one microphone. Now, I have seen pictures of Bill Black on stage with a microphone in front of him. So, I guess some places where they had more than one microphone, they would try to do something. But, real public address systems didn't come into play until, late 60s, early 1970s. I mean, before that, it was just like, I often wonder about how bad the sound must have been at so many of these legendary concerts that happened in the 1950s and 1960s. Because, yeah, it was just, guys with like 18-watt guitar amps, and that's it. And there's thousands of girls screaming. It's crazy.
Have you talked to anyone that seen those bands back in the day? Have you asked them, like, could you hear anything from the stage, or do you know
Yeah, and
anything?
I remember talking to a guy who saw a bunch of those package tours, back in the
Ah,
old days. And he said that everybody would be really quiet while the band played. Because, if you were in like a ballroom, he was telling me
oh.
about seeing bands coming through these ballrooms in the Midwest. Like he was from Wisconsin. And he had seen, Link Ray play in 1959 in Wisconsin. And he said, yeah, everybody just got really quiet so they could hear. And then, after the song was over, they'd clap like crazy. And then when they'd start, playing again, then they would get really quiet. And I think that was probably the way it was for the majority of things, and until there was somebody like Elvis who just drove the girls crazy and they couldn't control themselves.
Since we're talking about the approach back in those days, what do you think? Why did slap bass kind of almost disappear, even in rockabilly music? I mean, there was like a strong rockabilly tradition in Europe in the 60s and 70s, and slap bass kind of disappeared after the 50s. There was like no slap. I mean, there's few gems like, I don't know, You Most as Girl, with Bobby Lee Trammell that we called together, if you remember.
That's right.
That was a funny story. Whoever is interested, I'll tell him personally. But basically,
Yeah.
I found a phone of Bobby Lee Trammell because I think he was a governor of Arkansas at
He
that
wasn't a
time.
governor, but he was definitely in the government of something in Arkansas.
Something, right? And then we I asked D, can we just call him together, because I think it would be kind of weird if I call him with with a Serbian accent, and then
Yeah, you were really worried about your English and your Serbian accent and all that.
I just wanted to figure out like who played the freaking bass and knew Moses Girl, and then I figured out that's the best way to find out is if we call the guy directly.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a different story. But what do you think? What was the reason that kind of slap bass? I mean, upright bass in general, but especially slap bass became almost a bad word in rock and roll in the 60s and 70s, pretty much.
Well, I mean, you have to understand that, the electric bass was kind of slow to take off. It came out in 1951. There were even like other companies making electric basses in the 1930s and 1940s. But after the Fender came out with the precision bass, it really wasn't until like the mid to late 50s that people started using them. And that's why when Rockabilly was happening, it was still mostly upright bass. But, even a lot of Gene Vincent had an electric bass by 57. And, Elvis went to electric bass in 57. And so once the electric bass kind of firmly took hold, all upright bass players, except for jazz and orchestra guys, they were just out of business. So, you had to buy an electric bass and you had to learn how to play electric bass. And eventually, I think what happened is that, a lot of the older guys, they just kind of either died off or they were no longer playing. And in the case of guys like Marshall Lytle, he kept playing, but he was playing electric bass. And it wasn't until there was this nostalgia thing much, much, much later, like in the 1980s, where they said, hey, can you still play that slapping upright thing? And, Marshall was great. I mean, up until the day he died, he just played exactly like the records. It just had that still same great bass style. But it's a physical thing. And so a lot of the guys probably just were too old and couldn't pull it off anymore. And so, yeah, I just think electric bass really killed it for everybody. And the only reason that it came back at all was because there was this great sound on these old records and old videos that people wanted to hear again. But it's still just like such a tiny percentage of what it was back in the day.
Yeah, it's interesting to see and analyze that shift. But do you think that was mostly because people wanted a different sound, or it was because it was just easier to carry an electric bass comparable to an upright?
I think once the electric bass came out, they could actually hear the bass.
Well, yeah, I guess so. But even on the records, like there was no upright bass, there was no slap bass. I mean, in rockabilly, slap bass is essential part of rockabilly,
Yeah.
and it disappeared in the 60s. That's always kind of like mind-boggling for me. Why did this actually happen?
Well, what's interesting is that it was obviously still in people's minds because, like, you had these guys like, how do you pronounce his name? Henry Strzelecki, or I don't know how to pronounce his last name. The guy in Nashville. You know who I'm talking about?
I'm not sure.
There's a great video of him doing Alabama Jubilee, and he's just, going crazy. And then Joe Zinkin, right?
But that's Joe Zinkin. Joe Zinkin was doing Alabama Jubilee.
Okay, then I'm confusing him. There was another guy named Henry, and he had a Polish last name.
Okay.
And there was these odd records that would still pop out where you could tell like people sort of remembered the slap bass thing, like Conway Twitty's Long Black Train, which is like 1961 or 1962, and it has this great slap bass on it. And then Merle Haggard did a record in Nashville called The Old Man from the Mountains Coming Home. And that was early 70s. And I can't remember if it's Joe Zinkin or Bob Moore or who's playing it, but there's slap bass on there, and they're obviously trying to get a Maddox Brothers sound on that record. So I think it was in the back of people's minds, like that was something that people used to do, but it just was so commercially out of favor. Nobody really was out there doing it.
I have to check out that guy that you mentioned, because I'm not completely sure that I know who you're thinking
Hopefully
about.
I'm not, having one of my famous, grabbing 10 different things and inventing one person out of it. I'm pretty sure there was this other guy who did some slapping in the 60s. It was a Nashville bass player, kind of like not quite A-Team, but
Yeah. Have you ever had the chance like to see Joe Zinkin play by any chance?
No, but I did get to hang out with Bob Moore.
Yeah, okay, but I know lots of people that did it, but like Joe Zinkin, it seems that nobody even heard of him until kind of like fairly recently, maybe 10 years ago or something. I
Well,
heard
he was
about him.
older, right? I mean, in that video from the 60s, he looks like he's older, like he's maybe in his 50s then.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. He's definitely an older guy. He was definitely an older guy when, like, I mean, even when he played those those songs. But interesting thing is, I mean, in the slap bass world, I heard about him from when he started playing when Johnny and Jack, I think,
Right,
and I heard about it maybe, I don't know, 20 years ago or something. And I remember that time, just because I was looking at the records, and then I was asking people, all the slap guys, people that knew about it, knew slap bass stuff, like they never heard of him. So I
right.
wonder, like, did you know about him back then, or like it was
No,
the
I
the
I
same
only
thing?
knew about him once the Bear Family box sets came out and I would see his name listed as under the
Okay.
discography and then when YouTube came out and that video of him just going crazy on Alabama Jubilee, it's like, wow, that guy was a monster.
Yeah, it's interesting because he's like really one of few guys ever in the history of slap bass that was featured as a solo guy on TV, and all of a sudden nobody knows about him.
Well, there you go.
I mean, yeah, and then yeah,
But
I
but
don't know.
but can I tell my Bob Moore story? Because it's one of
Of
my
course you
favorite
can.
favorite
Oh,
stories.
sorry, that was when you mentioned Bob Moore. You had like a Bob Moore story, like to say. Sorry that I
Yeah,
stopped.
well, I always tell people this story because it's so important when you understand just musicians in general, but also like, okay, well, why did they use these studio musicians in Nashville? Because it's like no matter whether it was rockabilly or country or soul or whatever, it's kind of like the same group of A-team musicians that played on all of them, and a lot of people's feelings got hurt because they'd show up to do their session with their own band, and they'd be like, "No, no, no, we got our own guys, and they're going to play it." Uh, so this story kind of illustrates why that happened. Bob Moore is this guy, and I'm sure you've talked about him on your show. He just passed away this last year, and he was by far the most recorded bass player in Nashville history, and maybe the most recorded bass player in American history. I don't know. He played on thousands and thousands of records, and chances are, if you are just listening to oldies radio in a grocery store or something like that, you will hear him playing the bass like several times a day because he played on that many hit records. Roy Orbison records and Patsy Cline records, and the list just goes on and on and on. So I got an opportunity to hang out with Bob and his wife Kitra. This would have been around 1999, I think, maybe 2000. And I really wanted to hang out with Bob to see if I could meet Grady Martin. And I could not meet Grady Martin because Grady was basically on his deathbed then. And Bob told me, like, he doesn't want to see anybody. If you drove out to his farm, he'd just chase you away or you wouldn't get to see him. But, we were hanging out with Bob Moore and trying to pick his brain about as much information as possible. And we went to a music store where he had the famous black bass that he played on so many things, and it was a really really old instrument where the hand rubbed finish had just kind of turned black. That's why they call it the black bass. And he started playing the introduction to King of the Road by Roger Miller that he had played on the original record on that bass, and it was like, oh wow, man, that sounds really good. But then later that night, we went to a club called the Station Inn to see an act called the Time Jumpers. And the Time Jumpers were like kind of an all-star Western swing band. Vince Gill was playing guitar. Ranger Doug was playing one of the other guitars. And the bass player they had playing in the Time Jumpers was excellent bass player. We sat there and watched them, and they were all just superb musicians. And so finally they see Bob Moore is in the audience and they say, "Hey, can we get Bob Moore up here to play bass on a number?" And so I remember seeing him walk up on stage. The bass player hands him the bass. They didn't touch anything on the amplifier. They didn't make any adjustments at all. Nothing, right? And this was in a small club where the bass wasn't even going through the PA system. It was just a bass amp sitting there on stage. That was it. And they start playing the next song, and Bob Moore is playing bass, and all of a sudden, the bass is twice as loud, and every single note is equal in volume, which was incredible because, you know, even great bass players, you see them play, and you know the acoustic bass just kind of lends itself to some notes being louder than others. It's just part of the physical thing of an upright bass. But the way that Bob Moore played it with his giant hands, he had hands that were like, you know, they were just huge. All the notes were perfectly even and they were twice as loud. And I remember watching it and going, holy crap, that's why that guy played on all those records, is because the recording engineers and the people who were putting these sessions together, they didn't have to do anything to that guy. All they did was just stuck a microphone in front of his bass and they were done. They didn't have to do anything else to get a great bass sound. They were done. That was it. And so that's why Bob Moore got to play on 7.
Have you ever heard him play slap by any chance?
When we went to that music store and he got out the black bass, you know, and he played the intro to King of the Road, we asked him if he would do a little slap bass. And I remember him saying like, well, I haven't done that in a really long time, you know, but then he did it just a little bit, just like that kind of a thing. And it was like, oh yeah, that's the sound right there.
I actually love his slap. You know, I'm bummed there's not more of Bob Moore's slap, and my favorite is probably the one that he did on with Tupper Saucy on the record called Seraj to Shostakovich. There's a scherzo for slapped bass. It's awesome.
I haven't heard that one, although I know Tupper Saucy.
Oh, do you know U.S. Mail by Elvis?
Yeah.
That one has slap bass solo. It's Bob Moore. It's the only
he played on so many records. It's yeah, insane.
But I think that's the only slap bass solo on Elvis record, U.S. Mail, and that's Bob Moore.
Yeah, if you're not counting, you know, the bits in Baby Let's Play House or the bits in My Baby Left Me or whatever.
Like
yeah,
two, you know, a little bit. Yeah, I mean that was like more part of the arrangement, I'd say.
Right.
Okay, so I would like to go back like to the people that actually you played bass, slap bass with. Like the list is kind of endless. Can you mention some of the names or all of them if you remember?
Well, you know, and this is where I have the worst memory in the world. Have you made a list, Djordje, or do I just need to go from scratch?
I didn't make your list.
Okay, well, list. You know, this is where it gets really bad because my brain is just a bunch of oatmeal. You know, there were guys like Sleepy LaBeef, who I played bass with and I played guitar with. And I've seen Sleepy play bass too. He was a great bass player. And a lot of times I would get those gigs because a guy like Sleepy, he doesn't have a set list. And he doesn't just do his original 1950s songs. You know, it'll be like, okay, now we're going to do Tear It Up, but then we're going to go into Amazing Grace. And then we're going to go out of that into, you know, Strange Things Happening by Sister Rosetta Tharpe. And we're going to go into that, into, you know, the instrumental version of Detour. And like, you know, a lot of these rockabilly bands, all they listen to is rockabilly. They don't listen to like the rest of the Great American Songbook, you know, blues and jazz and pop and just kind of like songs that everybody used to know. So a lot of those kind of gigs I would get just because I'd be like the only one who could follow him, you know? Geez. I remember playing bass with Herb Remington from the Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys, and the reason I did that was just because we had too many excellent guitar players, and I didn't want to pay a bass player. But that was just as much fun for me because, you know, those Bob Wills bass lines are great. It's kind of combination between pizzicato stuff and some slap stuff too. I know that I played bass for Joe Clay once too, and I can't remember why I wasn't playing guitar. Because you also played bass with Joe Clay several times.
Oh yeah, I did it. Yeah. You played bass for Scotty Moore.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
technically no. The one I'm trying to remember. Yeah. Okay, I played with Scotty several times, and a couple of them I was just playing second guitar. One of those times I was playing upright bass, and then there was another really weird gig where Scotty had put together this all-star band featuring Boots Randolph, the sax player that I admired, and he was going to play guitar, and there were 3 or 4, like I think Bob Moore was going to play bass, and 3 or 4 kind of other all-star guys. And boy, it just all fell apart right at the very end because I wound up playing bass because Bob Moore couldn't do it. And I was excited because I was going to get to play bass with Scotty Moore again. But then Scotty couldn't do it because he had like a heart attack or a stroke or something like right before the gig. And it wound up just basically being me playing bass for Boots Randolph with, you know, a couple other musicians there playing solos. Oh, they're Buddy Spiker, the very famous Nashville fiddle player. He was also in that band. So it could have been like one of the most awesome all-star bands ever. And it was a little disappointing, but it was still fun to do that gig. And the thing that really made me proud was that Scotty Moore recommended me to Boots and those guys when Bob Moore injured himself. It was like, well, just get Deke to play bass. He can do a real good job. And, you know, they had never met me or anything, but they just took Scotty's word.
That's great. Do you remember any other names?
Well, you know, there's some of the like the old blues guys that I played bass for. You know, like I played bass once for Billy Boy Arnold, and I played bass for Ray Sharp a couple of times, and the list kind of goes on and on. The problem is I should have made a list before we started this because you're just going to get a lot of me going, but yeah, there's been so many over the years, it's kind of hard to keep track.
That's great. Since I know that you're an expert for old recordings and, you know, vintage stuff, what would you say, by your opinion, were the most essential slap bass recordings?
Well, you know, man, it's really hard to get away from that subject without talking about those Bill Haley records from the 1950s because they, you know, you can tell that whoever was recording those things said that bass player guy, he's really important to the sound. We got to get that slap on there. You know, because basically they were sort of a typical band of that era playing a mixture of jazz and pop and maybe some rhythm and blues covers in there. There wasn't really anything of that band that was super different except for the slap bass, you know, and it was just that driving Marshall bass playing that they accentuated on the recordings. I mean, the slap is really, really present in the mix. And so definitely that caught my eye. And it's exactly the opposite on Gene Vincent record. You would think that a Gene Vincent record would have tons of slap bass on it, but Jack Neal, the original upright bass player, he was just playing pizzicato the whole time. So it's interesting what records accentuated the slap bass and what records didn't. When I started getting into, you know, obscure rockabilly records, you know, there's some of these records where the slap bass is just completely insane, you know, like Thunder and Lightning by Tudor Boatman and records like that, where they've got slap and echo. And so it's just this thing, just kind of like cacophony going off behind the singer. And my ears always picked up on that kind of stuff.
And do you know, are you familiar the way they were recording slap bass back then?
Well, you know, I've studied a lot of photographs, and I've talked to a lot of those old guys, and it's interesting because, man, it really kind of seems like they didn't really have a particular approach, like in the real early days, and a lot of it kind of goes hand in hand with the recording equipment that was available at the time. If you go back to the 1940s, nobody had more than about 3 mics, and they were usually ribbon mics, and they didn't have more than 3 or 4 channels on their mixing board. And so a lot of times the bass would have to share the microphone with the piano, or the bass would have to share the microphone with, the rhythm guitar or something like that. And so the miking of the bass was just a real approximate thing where they would position themselves in the room to get a fairly decent bass sound. But there wasn't a dedicated bass mic. And I find those records really interesting because some of them are really good and some of them have tons of bass on them. But then starting in the 1950s, I think, when they would get more channels on the mixing console and they had more microphones available, then you started having guys that would just mic themselves with a RCA Ribbon Mic or a Altec 639 or something like that. And again, depending on how good the bass player was, sometimes you got really amazing results out of just that one simple mic. And then I remember when we talked to Marshall Lytle, he said that they used to use 2 Altec 639s, if I'm remembering correctly, one for the bass and then one just to get the slap. The other one was kind of hanging right above his hand where he was slapping. And that's the first time I've heard of anybody using 2 microphones to record a bass. So it's all just been studying photos and then asking the few guys that were still around.
And what is your favorite way, like, to record slap bass?
Quite honestly, it really depends on the bass player, because a lot of bass players move around a lot. And if you're using a mic like the Altec 639, the proximity effect, like if you move an inch, the bass just goes away. Huh. So if I'm recording a really sloppy bass player, I'll use a dynamic mic like a, EV666 or something like that, just because it has sort of a real presence in the lower mid-range where you really want to hear it. And the proximity effect isn't that great. You can really move around quite a bit. But I'm lucky enough in the last couple of years, I have a really good copy of a Neumann U47. And, I wind up using that mic on a lot of things just because it's such an incredible sounding mic. And that's a really, really good bass mic. And it has enough top end to it that it'll pick up a ton of slap if you want to do that.
Have we used that mic like when we recorded, when I played bass at your place?
No, I can't remember what we used last time. That's been a long time ago.
Yeah,
when we did the sessions for years. Another one of my favorite mics, which I think is what we used when you recorded, is an RCA Ribbon Mic that came a little bit later called a BK5. It's not a very pretty mic, but it has a better response. It doesn't have as much of a proximity effect as a 77 or a 44. Like, you can move around a little bit, and it's excellent on upright bass and rhythm guitar and things like that. It's a really good sounding mic.
As far as like slap bass players, like older guys, do you have your favorite guys? Somebody that you would say were an influence to you as a bass player, or maybe just like somebody that had your favorite?
We've kind of already talked about them all, but I guess I would have to say that there's still a spot in my heart for Guybo that played with Eddie Cochran, because he started out playing slap bass, records like 20 Fly Rock and things like that. That's Guybo playing the slap bass. And then there weren't many guys like him who made the transition to electric bass and then had this really unique, identifiable style in electric bass. I mean, I love the way that Guybo played electric bass. He had like flat strings that were very muted, and then he would play with a pick, and he just got this. I mean, it's just a Guybo sound. Nobody else really gets that sound. So
he even used the capo sometimes.
Yeah, that's right. Which is crazy.
You know that I interviewed him on the Slapstream as well?
I think I got you his phone number, didn't I?
Oh, yeah, you did. I think so. I think you did.
or at least put you in touch with the guy that had it.
Yeah, something
But
like that.
you know, he played great upright bass and he played great electric bass, and I can't think of really any other guys that I can say that about.
He was excellent. And as far as the guys that that play slap bass now, like, do you have a list of guys that did you like?
Well, of course, I have to say my girlfriend Sally Joe, because she plays slap bass. She has her own band, the Stardust Ramblers. But then and she's in the other room, you know, so I have to throw that in there. She's laughing, but there's a lot of really good bass players around now, and I kind of think more than almost any time in history, where you have your guys like Kevin Smith and like you, Djordje, and then there's just, you know, guys like Jimmy Sutton and people who have seen you and seen Kevin Smith and seen Jimmy Sutton, who have become really good bass players. So I think there's kind of more now than there have been in years.
You might be right. I think that there's more like usable guys, like especially like that, you know, if you were looking for somebody that could cover a gig, it's now easier to find somebody that can do it.
Well, and
And
I have to say, the guy that I'm playing with, I have a new band. I have a new band called DEKE and the Whippersnappers. That's me and a couple of young guys. This kid Xander Griffith that plays bass, he's excellent. He's a great bass player, and you should have him on your show, because he's probably the best of the young kids playing bass that I've seen.
all right, thanks for the recommendation. I'll definitely check him out. I know who you're talking about, by the way. And so what I wanted to ask you, as far as like slap, is there anything else like slap? I think we're going like towards the end, so now I'm like,
Yeah, we run out of stuff to talk about now. We're gonna have to start
yeah.
talking
No,
about
we definitely
you know.
didn't. Like, I can talk to you, you know, for days and everything. Do you have like any recommendations or like advice that you would say like to bass players, or maybe even pointing out like a common mistakes that slap bass players do these days?
Well, the thing about the slap bass, I'm glad you asked me this, because I was actually trying to put this thought together before we did this stream thing. The problem with slap bass is that so many people get into it with that attitude of, oh, I want to do all the crazy slaps and the triple slaps and the quadruple slaps and the backward slaps and the tricks and you know, all this, and they don't spend any time like actually learning how to play bass. And for me, I really love slap bass and I love it when it's done well, but I really don't like it when somebody just does a bunch of slap tricks, but then they don't really know how to play good bass lines, or they don't know how to like, or they don't actually learn the chord progressions of the songs. And there's been a lot of those kind of guys that I've played with over the years, and it's kind of like, yeah, you're not really in this to be a musician in a band. You're just doing this to show off and, you know, look impressive to some girl that's sitting right there or something. I don't know. So if I had to give advice, I would say, before you start learning all the slapping tricks and everything else, just make sure that you actually know how to play the bass, that your intonation is good, that you learn the songs. If you're playing bass for somebody and they hand you a list of songs, learn the goddamn songs, man. Learn all the changes before you decide how you're going to throw in crazy slapping tricks. And then if you have all that sort of basic stuff down, then you can throw in the slapping stuff and twirl your bass around, and it's all good because the bass is covered, and then you're just adding more stuff to put on a show. But when it's all just show and there's no real like actual bass playing going on, that's a real drag. So that's my best piece of advice.
That's a great advice, and I would add that, you know, in at least in the music that we like to listen to the most, I think that achieving that pocket with the drummer and the rhythm section is kind of like the most essential part, because if this music doesn't groove, it doesn't have anything. I mean,
That's true, and you know,
point.
you can listen to some of these records that have been popular in recent years, like Northside Gal by J.D. McPherson. You know, I know for a fact that, you know, Jimmy Sutton and Alex Hall worked really hard on getting that groove where they lock in together and it's like the perfect tempo for dancing. And, you know, those things aren't accidents. I mean, those things are worked on and talked about and planned, and then they come together and it's really good. But you can't have like an accidental great groove. I mean, it's like you and the drummer have to really sort of figure that stuff out.
You mentioned a little bit like a different slap bass, like more complex slap bass patterns. Do you, or do you use, and are you familiar with that, like a single slap, double slap, triple slap type of thing, or you use like a different lingo when describing different slap patterns?
Well, when I was doing it just a minute ago, I was kind of making stuff up to be funny. You know, I know single slap and double slap and triple slap and all that, but beyond that, I really don't know. I've heard you bass players talk about that stuff a lot of times, but then it just kind of, you know, turns into bass geek talk, and I just don't listen anymore. But I'm sort of fascinated by it, especially guys that are real good at it, like you and Kevin Smith. It's like, wow, I mean, there's like all these different rhythm patterns that you can do with the various slapping, and again, if you do it right and it's crafted correctly, it's great groove and a great feel. But then sometimes it's just a bunch of clickety clack.
I agree. Even I love slap bass. You know, my life mission is slap bass, but you know, I agree with you. Do you remember when was the first time you hearing like those like particular names like single slap, double slap? Did that exist back in the day, back in the 50s, or that's kind of like a more like a neo rockabilly thing?
I think it's well, and you know, literally the first time I ever saw anybody doing any kind of fancy slapping was Kevin Smith. And he was doing these kind of things where nobody else could do that. And all the other slap bass players were just doing simple dig, 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 dig. And he was doing these things that were like, whoa, what is he doing? And I mean, I was a guitar player, but I don't think anybody really had names for him back then. It was just like, wow, what is he doing? And it wasn't really until like the last 15 or 20 years that I heard these specific terms being talked about.
Yeah, I like talking to like especially older guys and especially like bluegrass and rockabilly people, and then asking them those things. And it seems that there's the same names were used like for different patterns in different music genres. So I'm trying to make sense out of it, and then
right,
I will, you know. But that's one of the reasons why I'm documenting all these people. All right. So before we end, I have like one more question for you. Can you hear me, or
God damn it? Have we been on here for 90 minutes? It's time to go, Djordje. I got to do some stuff today.
That's what I just told you, right? So I have like one more question for you, but before that, I would like to know: is there anything else that you would like to add, or is there something that I missed that it's important for the future of slap bass?
Well, you know, the funny thing is, even like when I started, it was like, man, this is something that's dead, and there's just a couple of people that are interested in it. And it's been really interesting to see since, you know, I was 15 years old until now, how it's actually gotten more popular and there's more people wanting to do it. So at one point I would have said this is totally dead and it's never going to really come back. But now it seems to be back, and it's here to stay. And I think that as long as there's great new players coming up and people get excited about it, that it's going to be something that still keeps going on, you know, way into the future.
Thank you, and I hope that's true, and I'm fighting for that. Now, when all these slap streams are on YouTube, yeah, it's definitely doesn't leave the planet.
Well, you know, we have to get back to just actually having gigs again and festivals again. That's the first step. But it seems like we're slowly getting back there.
But you're playing kind of not as much as you used to, but you're going back on the road these days, right?
Well, yeah, it's kind of weird. I'm doing a lot of club shows that, you know, don't pay very well. Basically, all of the festivals just got canned, and all the European festivals. And that was a big hit, you know, to my yearly income. And so I really can't wait for the European festivals to come back. But I'm still keeping busy here in the States. It's just mostly like local shows and club shows.
All right. So my last question for you is, because you had like long and productive career, and you've been doing what you wanted to do pretty much since you became aware of the possibilities out there. What inspired you to still do what you do after all these years?
I still like music. That's the funny thing. I was just doing a recording session the last few days, and we had some really excellent musicians on it. We had DJ Bonebreak on drums, and Murray Hammond, who plays electric bass for this band, the Old 97s, and we had Carl Sonny Leyland playing piano. And man, just, playing music with excellent musicians is just always going to be fun for me. And I'm really lucky that I've been able to keep it going as a career. But I would imagine, even if the career goes away, that I'm still going to enjoy being able to play music with excellent musicians whenever I can.
Well, that's definitely one of the best things. And I just realized that I lied. I have one more question for you. So since you're a songwriter, and then pretty much you always play your songs that I love, and I think they're amazing, and I really always admired your writing, not just music writing, like even when you write little stories on your Facebook, or when you tell these stories, or if you write for guitar magazines. But I would like to hear how important for you is to write bass lines when you actually write new songs. Is that a part of it, or you just like something like to follow it?
I generally write a song with a general idea of how it's supposed to sound in my head. And if we're putting it together in the studio, I like to see what the bass player comes up with first, because a lot of times they will come up with something different that I did not think of that's great, But then other times they'll come up with something that doesn't seem to fit, and I'll have to say like, oh no, let's play a 1/5 in the verses and walking during the choruses and the solos, something like that. But I always like to see what the bass player is going to come up with first, because every now and then it'll be something really interesting and different.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Deke, for 94 minutes of slap bass talk.
God damn you, Djordje. I got stuff to do today, man. This was only supposed to be an hour.
But there's nothing more important than slap bass. So you contributed to the history. So
well, thanks for having me on the show, Djordje. And
awesome. Can't wait to see you. Can't wait to play. Can't wait to play with you again, and and can't wait to see you play slap bass again.
Haven't seen you in forever, so it's good to see you here on the screen.
Awesome. We'll make it happen soon.
Okay. Well, thanks, man. Awesome.
Good luck with everything, and see you soon.
Okay. Thanks, Djordje.
All right. That was DEKE Dickerson for 90 minutes. He originally told me, like, make sure that it's under 1 hour. And I was like, come on. I can't have the shortest slap stream now after I had, Jeff Raffredo for 6 hours, or Kim Neckerman for 4, and all these other people that were like, a couple hours. So I felt that DEKE has lots to say, so I wanted to hear that personally, and I think that you should have heard all these stories personally as well. Thanks a lot. Thanks, DEKE. Thanks to all of you that's been following me, for subscribing. If you haven't subscribed, if you haven't slapped that subscribe button, make sure to do that now. I can wait until you hit that, until you slap that subscribe, and do that too. It helped me out with this weird YouTube algorithm. Leave a comment if you'd like me to feature your favorite bass player. There's like lots of people out there that I would like to talk to. My goal for now is like to reach 100 episodes. I'm not sure. That's like still, 33 more episodes. So I'm not sure if I definitely know more than 33 bass players that I would like to interview, but text me. Send me don't text me. Send me leave a comment in the under this video, so that I can actually see who would you like me to feature. And besides that, thanks a lot for supporting the Slapstream via Venmo and PayPal if you feel like supporting, and if you think that I should continue doing the Slapstream, hit those links in the description of this video. Get these t-shirts. Here's the red one, Art of Slap Bass. There's several designs available. The link is as well in the description of the video. And Patreon, check out the Patreon. Offer lots of cool perks over there. And in the meantime, don't forget, never fret, slide it in smooth and keep it in the groove. I'm Djordje, and I will see you next Saturday.